Hello, everyone. For today's encouragement, I want to take you to 1 Peter chapter 4 and verse 8. And the title of this would be Priority Number 1. Now, Peter, as you know, is writing to people who are believers. In this particular case, he speaks about a matter of urgency because, he writes, the end of all things is near. Now, if the end of all things is near and time is short, and he tells us that there are things we ought to do, then we need to pay attention. It's sort of like not having enough money. You spend it very, very wisely and very, very carefully. Well, if the Lord was near in the first century, 2,000 years later, you can believe it is really near. So it is a priority for us. In light of that fact, he tells us in 1 Peter chapter 4 and verse 8, above all, love each other deeply because love covers a multitude of sins. This is actually the second time when Peter writes that we need to love one another deeply. The first time he writes that is actually in chapter 1 and verse 22. He says, we are to love one another deeply because we have been born again. That's the first time and the first reason he tells us to do this, simply because of a personal relationship with Christ. Then he goes on to say a second time, love one another deeply because he's coming soon. 2 reasons to love one another deeply. Let's keep in mind that when he writes this command to love, he's not talking about emotional feeling. Oh, we can feel great things about love, butterflies in our stomach and walking in sunshine. But the reality is when we are told in the scriptures to love one another, we are told to behave in a certain way. We know that that is true from 1 Corinthians chapter 13. Where Paul, by definition, tells us that love is patient, love is kind, love does not envy, it does not boast, it is not proud. So love are things we do, and there are things that we do not do because we love. Love is something you do. The Bible says Jesus demonstrated his love for us. That's in 1 John chapter 3 and verse 16. This is how we know what love is, John writes. Jesus Christ laid down his life for us. And John went on to say, because he has done this for us, we ought to lay down our lives for our brothers. It's something you and I do, just as it is something that Jesus Christ did for us. We love one another deeply because we have been born again, and, Peter writes, because the end of all things is near. We're never given a choice about who it is that we are to love. We are told that we are to love one another. And the one another really means one another. It's not just people who are nice to us or people in our family or people in our neighborhood or people we get along with. We love as Jesus loved. He loved everyone and took the action to love one another by demonstrating that in his death in our behalf, everyone's behalf, if in fact you would trust him. The Bible says we're to love one another deeply. Now, the range of meanings of that Greek word is translated many ways. It could actually be translated these ways. Love one another earnestly, or love one another eagerly, or love one another zealously, or love one another fervently. All of these things are in the range of the meaning of how it is we are to love one another. As born-again follower of Christ, in light of the fact that time is short, we are to love one another deeply. I like what Anne Lamott writes when she says, there are certain people whose company you love, whose mind you just love to pick, whose running commentary totally holds your attention, who makes you laugh out loud. When you have a friend like this, she can say, hey, I've got to drive up to the dump in Petula. Do you want to come along? And you honestly can't think of anything in the world you'd rather do. By the same token, a boring and annoying person can offer to buy you an expensive dinner, followed by tickets to a great show. And in all honesty, you'd rather stay home and watch the Jell-O harden. Above all, love one another deeply, the Bible says. It's a command to love everyone in action, even boring and annoying people who always seem to have a black cloud hanging over their head. Love one another deeply. We're challenged to do so because we have been born again and because time is short. Now, when it comes to love one another deeply, there are a couple of benefits that we are promised in the scriptures that we will gain. The first one is right here in this verse, chapter 4 and verse 8. Because love covers a multitude of sins. Love one another deeply because love covers a multitude of sins. What does that mean? Well, I think we can take the meaning from 1 Corinthians chapter 13, where Paul writes that love keeps no record of wrongs, as an example of what it means to love one another deeply and then have sins covered. When we love one another deeply, we release the hurt and destroy the taproot of bitterness, the sin against us that a person has committed. It covers over a multitude of sins. Second benefit is in John chapter 13 and verse 35. By this, everyone will know that you are my disciples if you love one another. It's a testimony to other people. When you love people who don't deserve it or who have treated you badly, you love them still. Wow, there's something about that person. Love one another deeply is a testimony. That's a benefit. And the third is in 1 John chapter 3 and verse 14. We know we have passed from death to life because we love each other. So this benefit has to do with our own heart. When we see ourselves loving and showing grace to people who don't deserve it, that ought to be a testimony in our heart. But God is doing something in me. His grace is being poured out on me. It's a wonderful thing and a wonderful benefit. Now, as a born-again follower of Christ, in light of the fact that our time is short, priority number one is love one another deeply. May God encourage you to do that today.